Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 14th edition of Invariant's Dialogue for Change. My name is Joseph Vaughn, and I'm honored to serve as your moderator for today's session entitled Fostering Greater Inclusion and Retention Through Allyship, Mentorship, and Sponsorship Strategies. Invariant launched the DFC in the wake of George Floyd's killing to share knowledge and foster understanding among senior executives and government relations professionals on social matters impacting us all. Past DFC sessions have focused on dynamic business practices and public policy issues, such as closure of the racial and gender pay gaps, fostering engagement with Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z, establishing employee resource groups, and supporting equity and justice for the Asian Pacific Islander community. We encourage you to visit Invariant's website to view past sessions, and we will add a link to the DFC repository in the chat window. Our hope is the content from today's session will serve as a catalyst in the implementation of business practices that will advance greater inclusion in your firm's workforce and perhaps inspire each of you to build bridges of support and understanding to your colleagues and emerging leaders in your personal networks. We all have the capacity to serve as an ally, a mentor, and/or a sponsor. Let me begin by saying thank you to the esteemed panel of experts we've assembled today. We are joined by Audrey Pendergrass-Lee, who serves as the Vice President of Talent Acquisition and Chief Diversity Officer for FINRA. Audrey is the driving force behind FINRA's annual Diversity Summit, which is always a tremendous resource to Chief Diversity Officers and D&I stakeholders. Our second panelist is Todd Sears, who is the founder and CEO of Allyship LLC. Allyship has been instrumental in making LGBTQ plus equality a priority in global C-suites across industries. Todd, thank you for being with us today. Last but certainly not least, we are joined by Brad Bin, who serves as the co-head of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion practice in the Americas for Russell Reynolds. Brad also co-chairs the financial services practice for Russell Reynolds for the New York City tri-state region. Brad, we're happy to have you with us today. I would be remiss if I did not thank each of you for attending today's session and share our hope to have an interactive dialogue with you. To that end, thanks for your questions submitted with your RSVPs, and we welcome your thoughts through the chat window as well. We've reserved time on today's agenda for your questions, but we'll try to pivot to the audience questions throughout the session. Let's begin. The Harvard Business Review defines allyship as a strategic mechanism used by individuals to become collaborators, accomplices, and co-conspirators who fight injustice and promote equity in the workplace. In many respects, allyship has become synonymous with providing moral support for and empathizing with the LGBTQ community. Todd, Allyship has conducted recent analysis on the importance of allyship and its impact on employers. Would you like to briefly share the analysis with the audience to provide perspective on why allyship is such a critical tool in the fight for equity for one's colleagues who are members of the LGBT community?
Sure. And before I do, I want to thank you, Joseph, and the entire team for putting this together. And it's a pleasure to be with Audrey and Bradley. I'd love to actually share the research, but also just give a little bit of context for Allyship and what we're doing around the world, because I think that will set the stage for the allyship. As you mentioned, Allyship is a global organization. We are the first and only global LGBT B Corp. And our purpose is to help business create a better world. And the idea behind it is because we believe, and I've sort of done this for almost 24 years, and Audrey and I were discussing prior lives in banking. But I firmly believe that equality should and does drive, business does and should drive equality. And that really is our guiding principle. The three sort of pillars of our model are building business, developing talent, and driving equality. But in that order, I think that companies and businesses have to understand that broad LGBTQ inclusive diversity and inclusion is a business driver and a business opportunity, but also a business obligation. You've got to develop the right talent, and equality is the output. We now count 98 companies. The slide's actually even out of date. We've had several join the last 2 weeks. 98 companies are members of Allyship all over the world. We do have summits in New York, London, Hong Kong, Paris, and Sydney. Talent initiatives for young gay leaders, for women, for board leadership, all of that in service of advancing LGBT equality. In 69 countries, it is still illegal to be gay, but in all of those countries, our companies do business. And that's really the framework. And if you think about it from an allyship perspective, kind of shifting gears, we did a piece called Ally Up that we published almost 2 years ago. My colleague Jane Berry Moran and I co-authored it, and it was a 5,000 person survey across 11 countries. And the framework really was to kind of dive into exactly what you said, Joseph. What is allyship? What is an ally? And how does that vary across the world? And how does it impact LGBTQ people's ability to come out in the workplace? But also more broadly, I love that the Harvard Review article that you mentioned used the word accomplice. I was at a LinkedIn summit a few years ago, and an amazing woman was speaking, and she really struck me with the framework that she talked about, which was instead of being an ally, be an accomplice. And the idea of allyship too often is that there's a power dynamic, right? Someone that has the power is imbuing that power to someone who is diminished or doesn't have that power. And there's generally some sort of economic or racial or gender or orientation inequality there. But the idea of an accomplice is that someone's beside you in the fight. They're literally in the trenches. They are at your level and you are fighting something together and trying to push something together. Our research didn't focus on that, but I really think that's one important point to mention. We do say that ally has to be a verb, though. It is all about action. And there's a concept called covering, which I know a lot of folks know, and it really ties into allyship, because if you're an ally, you help people uncover. There's a guy named Kenji Yoshino, who was actually on our leadership board many years ago, and I think we have all worked with him over the years. And he wrote the book Covering, the Hidden Assault on Our Civil Rights. And the idea of covering is that it saps productivity. It's that you are hiding aspects of your identity in a workplace or a group setting. And it literally does impact how you were able to be yourself, how you're able to be productive. And our research found that 52% of LGBTQ people actually channel 30% of their time in the office, and this is global, by the way, hiding or downplaying their sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, that's people who are already out at work. We focused for so many years about just being out in the workplace, but we haven't actually talked about the covering idea. When you look in the United States, it's actually even higher than that. And that ultimately does drive talent out the door. 24% of LGBTQ workers have moved away from anti-gay states. And that's one of the things we do a lot of speaking about right now, because there have been 131 anti-trans bills in 31 state legislatures in the last 12 months. And there is a direct economic talent impact to these discriminatory laws that serve no purpose. They're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. And if you think about the 36% of LGBTQ workers are thinking about leaving those states who haven't already, there is a brain drain of talent that is coming from direct discrimination. So when we think about that from a corporate culture, only 63% of LGBT workers feel their workplace is affirming and safe most of the time. 58% hide their identity, and 70% of LGBTQ employees cover, with the number one reason being they're worried about not being promoted. And all of this ties into allyship, because if you are an ally, the number one reason that people come out of work is knowing that they are surrounded by allies, people who are supportive of them. Interestingly, the number one reason people are not out at work globally is that they don't want to make the people around them uncomfortable. And I want to just highlight that, because that is a universal experience of being different. One of the things that we learned from Black Lives Matter 2 years ago was that so many of our companies and leaders finally started doing listening tours of Black and brown employees around the country. And it was one of those sort of, should have been an aha moment, or shouldn't have taken George Floyd to actually have people do such a thing. But one of the takeaways was that so many people of difference said that they've been told for their entire careers, don't make the white people around you uncomfortable. Don't share stories of discrimination. Don't share stories of racism, because you've got to keep those folks comfortable so that you can progress. I was on a panel earlier this morning, and a woman of color was beside me, and she said she literally, for her entire career, focuses on not being the angry Black woman. She is covering. She is trying to make sure that she makes everyone else around her comfortable. Well, LGBT people have to do the same thing. Don't be too gay. Don't be too butch. Don't be too switch. Don't be too femme. Don't be too whatever, so that the majority population, whatever that is, feels comfortable. And I share that because all of these conversations are intersectional in nature. Yes, LGBTQ people are my focus, but there are LGBT people of color, LGBTQ women, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea that allyship cuts across all of these different dimensions and actually helps people feel better in a workplace, be more productive. It's actually one of the things that I think we should all be focusing on. I'm going to skip through a couple of these because there's a lot of data and I don't want to take up the whole session on these slides. But I think that the final thing I want to share with you is this, which is the idea that working from home has actually diminished allyship, but uncovering has happened more. People have actually on a Zoom screen feel much more sort of equal, if you will, because everybody swears the same. It's hard for you to talk over people. And you actually have that experience of sort of being a part of a group. The final thing I'll say is something I've been thinking a lot about just in the last probably, I don't know, 6 months, which is post Roe v. Wade and all of these different social movements. I think there's an opportunity for us to sort of move past the sort of dimensions we have looked at for the last 30 years that have not really changed, right? Looking just beyond race and gender and thinking about people as humans, right? We want to categorize people, and are they LGBTQIA+, are they African American, Black, BIPOC? Like, we want to have a name for everything versus we're humans. And we actually need to just interact as humans, support each other as humans, respect people as humans, understand where they come from, where they want to be. And I think the workplace could actually really advance that. And it's, I think, more about people who want to move forward versus people who want to move backwards. And I think that takes it out of the political realm, out of the religious realm, and hopefully into an area that allies are just commonplace. So thank you for letting me sort of share that, and look forward to the conversation.
And thank you, Todd, for that. And I just want to ask a quick follow-up. With such stark numbers, with up to 70% of workers not being comfortable coming out and be their authentic self, how does one serve as an ally to a colleague who may or may not be a member of the LGBTQ community without being offensive or invasive in terms of talking and supporting them?
That's a great question. I'd say several things, and I'd say it's not just for LGBTQ people. It's one, being authentic and telling your story. It's sharing stories where maybe you felt different in an environment, whoever you are, if you're a straight white man, if you're a person of color, if you're an LGBTQ person, because humans want to connect. And if you role model the behavior of sharing where you felt uncomfortable and how you shifted that and how that shaped your leadership style, then people will get that message. And I like to say that LGBT people are the canary in the coal mine of a broader corporate culture, because we are invisible until we choose to come out to you. Mm-hmm. So what a company does for an invisible population sends a message to all the visible minorities, whoever they are, and the majority, by the way, that they matter and that they are safe. Mm-hmm. And so that creating that safety, I think, is probably the number one thing people need to do.
And that invisibility also extends to persons with disabilities and others. You used the word intersectionality, Audrey. The beneficiaries of successful D&I strategies are multidimensional. Now, when a company creates a hybrid work environment to help support working parents, that benefits everyone. Don't we all need to have allies in one form or another? How does one look at allyship as being transcendent to support all segments of the workforce?
So first, I want to say thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I don't know if you could see me looking down, but I've been taking copious notes. I always feel honored when I can sit back and be a student and on a panel at the same time. Todd, thank you for that masterclass in 13 minutes, right? So, I think there's a lot to unpack, just even building on Todd's data that he provided, right? And what really strikes me, and Todd, I'm just going to quote you here for a second, the number one reason to not be out at work was not making others feel uncomfortable. So I would submit to you, yes, we all need allies. And frankly, yes, it is our responsibility to be allies to others, right? But more importantly, I would submit to you that an organization needs to be an ally, right, to their workforce and their population. So as you think about personal behaviors, that's one thing, right? And there are lots of actions we can take individually. But if organizations aren't building out inclusive practices, policies, right, and programs that allow people to feel safe, to feel comfortable, to build an environment of psychological safety for people to be able to bring their whole selves into this space, then we're not doing what we need to do. And it's an interesting conversation, right? Because our LGBTQ community has given us the language for this. And I'm sorry, it says my connection is unstable. Hopefully you all can hear us. Okay, perfect. The community has given us this language, and we as chief diversity officers have to translate that into our sphere of influence, which is the creation of practices, policies, programs that allow people to be themselves and bring themselves and feel safe to be a part of our organizations. And if we don't do that, we're not going to attract talent, we're not going to retain talent, and there's nobody to do the business of our business. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of where this matters, this makes sense, and organizations have taken action, right? So many years ago, we know that the diversity journey for organizations was, started with affirmative action, and it was, hey, let's make sure that we have racial diversity, and then a very significant focus for many years on women. right? And there were policies created to make sure women were able to return to the workforce if there was a break in service for child rearing years, that sort of thing. And one of those is flexible work arrangements. And what's interesting is there have been studies done that show that men actually disproportionately receive the benefit of the flexible work arrangement programs. And so what we know from that research, if you think about it, if you build the right practices and policies to support the least of them, the ones who need the most support, you're going to positively impact your whole organization in that culture. You know, another example is parental leave. Um, it, and again, it strikes me that we don't want to make others feel uncomfortable. Well, for many years, organizations, to include my own, have had paternity leave, right? So there was always this maternity leave that was focused on women because we need to be allies. We need to give them processes to be able to stay in the workforce and support them. But paternity leave was put out there as I'm sure, an afterthought. I didn't come up with it, but glad that it made it to the benefits package. But what we found is in that space is that men wouldn't take advantage of it, right? Because they didn't want others to feel uncomfortable. They didn't want to feel like they were taking advantage of a system, which would then derail their careers, right? Because they're making oh yeah, Bradley, you took that parental leave. So, I mean, you're not serious about your job. That's what women do. And so I think the next piece of this in terms of organizational support and organizations being good allies is that representation matters. And so the leaders in our organization have got to model the behaviors that they want the rest of our team members to exhibit so that we continue to build this culture of inclusion. And I will share with you, in no small way do I credit the LGBTQ community for helping us through that equity piece of parental leave, because once our LGBTQ community parents decided that, hey, me and my husband are getting ready to have a kid, and so I can't take maternity leave because I didn't actually birth this little person. But I am going to take advantage of this paternity leave. And oh, by the way, why is there inequity in terms of bonding time with our children? And I have a very amazing out colleague. His name is, he's an executive vice president, Rick Berry, who took his full parental leave. So FINRA moved to a parental leave policy that was the full 12 weeks, irrespective of gender. If you're the primary care winner, and then an additional 12 weeks. And by this executive vice president modeling that it is important, you will never get those first 6 months back with your little people, right? It allowed both men and women to be able to be on equal footing, because there's not a time where a manager can say, well, if you're not a woman, you shouldn't be doing this, right? Because then it falls completely in the face of what we're attempting as an organization to establish, is that we're an ally for all, and these programs and policies have got to be equitable for all, and there should be no distinction between your performance, your ability to move forward in this organization, your ability to be productive and rewarded because you have life events. So I want to pause there. Again, I feel like I could talk forever on this, but I do think, to your question, Joe, everyone needs allies. Everyone can be an ally. And our organizations, our firms, they have to create policies and practices that show the action that they are allies as well.
Thank you for that, Audrey. We feel your passion. Brad, I want to pull you into the dialogue. One of the core goals of diversity, equity, inclusion is to empower business leaders to bring their authentic selves to the work environment. If leaders are, and if team members are more concerned about the relative level of discomfort their colleagues may feel, how does that impact the goal of having workers bring their authentic selves to work? And then what does that do in terms of authenticity, productivity, innovation, and profitability ultimately That are we losing something when folks are in the space but aren't comfortable? And then finally, how does allyship play into as a solution to that conversation?
Sure, and a lot of questions in there, so I'll try and unpack and address some of them. Look, authenticity or being inauthentic actually is exhausting. It takes time, energy, and effort for you not to be your full self. And so what does that do? Well, then it that time, energy, and effort takes away from your ability to focus on some of your core responsibilities and deviates you a little bit more from the mission and the focus of what you're trying to do, which then impacts your overall efficiency, which then impacts the overall productivity, right? So I do think there is a direct correlation between corporations or organizations enabling or fostering environments where individuals can be their authentic self with their ability to more efficiently and effectively deliver output in whatever form or fashion that may be. Put it simply, if there's X hours of energy that one extends, it's going to be X plus Y if they have to kind of put on the mask or put on the extra shield or whatever they have to do to try and be something that they're not, right? Having said all that, I do think, look, there's, from an authenticity space, there's also a piece about understanding somewhat of the organization as well. And this is not about trying to conform, but also understanding kind of, the organization itself. Like, look, if you're authentic, be a little bit facetious, but, part serious, like, if your authentic self is I love to sleep, so I can't ever get there on time, well, that ain't gonna work, right? But at the same time, you have to understand, be true to yourself and not at all sacrifice what you're trying to do within an organization. What are some ways that that organizations can do that? I think was part of your question there, Joseph. And I think there's a few things. Of course, allyship is one way to do that. But I also think part of it is recognizing the individual. And I also think what Audrey said, I couldn't agree more in terms of being there for individuals. But I think there's also a piece about being there consistently. Consistency, I think, is key. And you have to be there, like any good relationship, through the good times and through the bad times. I think we all hopefully have friends in our lives. Sometimes they say, who your true friends are when times are tough. The same can be true about an organization in terms of, are they really committed to you as an individual when times are tough? If we start to head into a little bit more turbulent economic times, do some of these DE&I initiatives and initiatives focused on inclusivity all of a sudden fall by the wayside, or those budgets all of a sudden get cut? I venture to say if that's the case, that's absolutely the wrong thing for corporations to do. In fact, what they should be doing is doubling down and leaning in, because folks are going to ultimately recognize the true intentionality of a company or individuals or leaders based upon how they're acting during those times. So that's one other thing. The other piece I would also look to say is that I think it's also important for folks to recognize either corporations, leaders, they may not have all the answers. They likely don't have all the answers. None of us have all the answers about everything. So ask the questions, and ask the questions in an authentic way, and listen. And genuinely listen. There's a reason we have two ears and one mouth, right? So ask the questions and listen, and have some of those individuals inform me about how they're feeling. Inform me about suggestions about what they think they can do within the corporation to be more successful or to create better allyship or mentorship within the organizations. So listen, ask the questions, create that safe space, but then also be committed to act. And so that's important. It can't just be, because honestly, it's not the sole responsibility of X group to cure all the ills of said corporation. It's everybody's responsibility, right? So that's just a couple thoughts there.
That's helpful, Brad. If I might just focus on one of the things you said, you focused on the exhaustive effect that sort of carrying this weight has on one's shoulders, whether you're willing to talk and speak to the concerns you may have. But I often say that diversity, equity, and inclusion requires introspection, whether it's from the organizational standpoint or individually, to understand what are the things that I as an individual can do or need to learn and better understand. How do C-suite leaders and business leaders try to spur that curiosity where folks may feel that fatigue, whether you're one of the a person who's aggrieved or just a bystander? When you think about allyship, how do you spur and create environments where it's not just an insular conversation around those folks who are allies or members of these various communities, but make it more broaden it, open it, and bring in all team members to understand that it's integral to their own success and the organizational success?
Yeah, look, I think that there's a couple ways. One, there's a saying, we might walk the same path, but wear different shoes, right? And I think that's very true in many instances. And so part of it is education, and part of it is awareness, right? About things that you just don't ever, some folks in the majority population just would never have to face and never have to deal with. And so part of it is actually just about trying to bring awareness. And I always think that there's a video, Joseph, I'll send it to you afterwards if perhaps you want to send it out to the group. I think it's called like the 100-meter race or something along those lines. It's on YouTube, and it talks about a race to getting to the finish line. And I'll send the video out. I don't want to kind of too focus on that, but it is fascinating when you sometimes depersonalize things a little bit and help people understand, yes, there are inequities in the society that we have. There are, right? You might not affect you directly, but there are, right? And so understand that those things are the case. And if you are really truly committed to really trying to drive positive change for business or corporation, then it's incumbent upon us to try and improve diversity, equity, and inclusion, because there's all kinds of statistics that show that corporations that have higher levels of diversity and inclusivity are far more profitable, far more innovative, and have much better relationships with those customers than those that don't, than those that are very homogeneous.
Terrific. Thank you, Brad. Todd, I want to pivot back to something you covered. As you may know, a large segment of this audience are government relations professionals, those folks who work on public policy matters. You highlighted the fact that there are a plethora of states that have policies that are directly impacting the LGBTQ community and segments of their workforce. You highlighted how, in some cases, it's caused higher attrition amongst these segments of the workforce. When you think about public policy, how can companies foster more inclusive environments in geographic regions where there may be these external factors that are polarizing the workforce and the work environment? How do you make sure you keep those team members as a part of the team and encourage them to understand that the work environment, that the company recognizes that it's a safe space and they value this segment of the workforce?
Well, it's a multi-layered question and lots of things we could talk about with that. And I want to actually comment on, before I answer that, on what Bradley and Audrey were speaking about as well, and the idea of the fatigue, and also the idea that if you're the diverse person in the room, it's your job to talk about diversity, whoever that is, right? That burden has been a real thing for people for as long as we've talked about this, right? And I think that allyship needs to be that the majority population needs to take these on. And there's an idea by a guy named Martin Davidson at Darden School who talks about managing diversity versus leveraging difference. And the idea of managing diversity is it's a problem to be solved, and it only focuses on the 6 areas of visible difference. It's only living in HR, and it doesn't have business connectivity, but you're also valuing difference differently. You're saying, I have too many of this, which is generally straight, white, majority men, and not enough of that, whatever that is, people of color, LGBTQ, people of difference. And so you create this value inequality, and you're saying basically people you have too many of don't matter, and people who don't have enough of only matter because of immutable characteristic, not their talents and their abilities. And so that has been how corporations have looked at diversity, unfortunately, for a really long time, versus leveraging difference, which is an opportunity, not a problem. And it's focused on the areas of difference that are much beyond race and gender, and all about opportunity being a business driver. And so I share that because I think that framework will be helpful, because, as I think all of us on on the panel and seen, like the numbers just don't always change because we're trying to change a lagging indicator with a with a leading indicator mentality. So I think just to say that, because I wanted to reflect on especially what Bradley was just saying. As it relates to the government affairs pieces, I think several things. When I started at Leadership, our first summit was in March 2011. And it was the first time more than one CEO had spoken about gay rights issues in history. And now we've had over 700 CEOs speak at our summits around the world. I share that because then it was a risk for them to speak about it, and they knew it was a risk. Now it's a risk for them not to speak about LGBT issues or Black lives or Roe v. Wade. I mean, these used to be polarizing political, social issues. And there are still people who think that they are. I was at dinner this last week with several, major hedge fund folks who said, well, I'm not going to talk about Roe v. Wade just as an example. And I said, well, your employees actually expect you to, because the world has changed and that's putting people's lives in danger, literally. And you don't have the luxury any longer. If you are a purpose-driven organization, which if you're not, you won't be around in 10 years. If you're not a purpose-driven organization and you don't hew to your purpose and you don't speak about your purpose as the driving force for why you exist, people won't work for you. The Great Resignation proves that. People do not want to work for companies that they don't believe in any longer. They don't want to do jobs that don't make them satisfied and make them feel fulfilled. And companies have to recognize that, and this is part of it. And that's what I mentioned earlier about moving forward versus moving backwards. It's not about Black lives or LGBT people or women's right to agency over their own bodies. It's all of these things as humans. And I think from a government perspective, one, state governments have to pay attention to that. We have a climate index that Out Leadership launched 4 years ago, and we rank all 50 US states on 20 publicly identifiable data points around LGBT equality. Everything from conversion therapy being legal, which by the way, in 36 states, conversion therapy is legal. If you don't know conversion therapy, please look it up. It's a quackery science that kills people. HIV is still criminalized in 31 states. Trans people can't change their birth markers in so many states, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we aggregated all of that data and then we ranked the states on it, saying, look, this state is LGBTQ friendly. That means it's a business opportunity. This state, actually, South Carolina, for example, is the worst state in the country for LGBTQ people. So when companies are looking at where they want to invest resources and bring talent, that's what we want them to look at. And it's not a name and shame, but it's literally their economic cost of discrimination at state level. We had 4 states reach out to us after June 1st when we launched that index this year and say that they wanted to do better, which is exciting. So we're literally helping them with policies, making sure that board diversity, making sure that these different trans pieces and all these different sort of human aspects of their population are supported. And companies have to do the exact same thing. Companies no longer have the ability to say, oh, that's a social issue, we won't weigh in on that. That's not a thing any longer. There are actually states who have reached out to CEOs, Florida and Texas in particular, have reached out to CEOs of our member firms and have said, if you actually speak out against our anti-trans bills, or if you say that you're going to move your employees to states where they can receive medical care, we will no longer do business with you. Florida will not actually do a bond offering for you, or Texas. And that's really upping the ante. Companies literally have to say, do we care about business from states that discriminate? Or do we care about the purpose that we have in our business and in what our employees think? And I think that's—
If I might jump in on that point,
Yeah.
I mean, and this is really to the panel, in that moment where they have to make that decision, should they, I mean, obviously there are very, very real financial benefits or detriment that comes from making that tough decision. How do we, it's not a question of whether they should, the question is how do they evaluate that question in a way that allows them to continue to succeed and grow over time? Certainly you can't exclude some of the largest market economies in the country at state level. So what do they do in those situations?
Well, at first, I think ultimately that's why it's called leadership, right? Leadership's always about tough choices. If it were easy, you wouldn't be a leader, right? My first boss said they don't call it work and pay you for nothing. So, it is incumbent on leaders to actually start to have those conversations. And I think if it's only one company, that's a lot. But like Out Leadership has 99 companies. So if 99 companies say, you know what, we're not going to do business with countries or states who discriminate fundamentally against our people. I mean, it's not about a religious right, because there's no religious right to discriminate. Your religious right to discriminate ends where my civil rights begin, right? You don't have the ability to tell me that I'm an abomination and still take a paycheck from a company that believes that I'm not, right? That's not a thing, and companies have to not be afraid to say that.
Thank you. Audrey, Ben, Brad, anything to add to that point?
slightly controversial.
I think that's a good way to pivot to mentorship and sponsorship. We have about 25 minutes left in the session. Mentorship is defined as a guidance and knowledge sharing provided by experienced persons in a company or educational institution. Sponsorship is defined as helping relationship in which a senior or more powerful leader uses their personal clout to talk up, advocate for, place a junior person into a key role. Audria, can you highlight the key distinctions between mentorship and sponsorship as you think about DEI?
Yeah, when I think about a mentor, it literally could be anyone, right? A mentor is someone who helps infuse you with information that maybe you didn't have before, and or provides guidance and counsel to help you navigate through the workplace, right? So with a workplace context. When I think about a sponsor, that is someone who knows you well enough that they can speak for you when you're not in the room, right? So I could be a mentor uh, to someone, but never open my mouth as an ally, right? Take the action of being a sponsor in rooms where I have influence and the ability to elevate that person's profile, their work, and their potential. Um, I feel like as a mentor, not everybody has the ability to be in the room to have that influence. But if you're in the room and you have the ability to influence, and through a mentoring relationship, you've gotten to know someone uh, well enough to be able to speak on their behalf, I think that is, again, going back to that true definition of allyship. It, it is your role as an ally to do that. So again, we think about how you define who needs an ally and where the language comes from. Those who are not in position of power need allies. Those who are not a part of the in-crowd political process need allies if they are going to continue to uh, work to their full potential, reach their goals, their professional goals, and provide our organization with those diverse perspectives that we need. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I'll go back to organizations have to be allies because organizations have to encourage that sponsorship and provide spaces for the sponsorship opportunities to happen.
And Brad, to follow on that, to Audrey's point around power and access to power and proximity to being in a leadership role, to be in that room, surely there's a constraint on bandwidth. There's only so many leaders who are in those positions of authority who can help drive the opportunity for next gen leaders. When you think about the constraints that organizations face from mentorship and sponsorship perspective, how do they bridge that? How do they ensure that their leaders of tomorrow and today are not falling through the cracks?
Certainly. I think that there's a couple things that can be done. And even just backing up one step, I think it's important for individuals as they think about their careers and their success in corporations to have three core groups of people. There's mentors and there's sponsors. And I couldn't agree more with the definition that Audrey had for both. But I also think a third piece is confidants. These are people that sometimes that you can go to without fear, without judgment, and who will give you the authentic truth as they understand it to be. We all need sometimes those people who will be those truth tellers to you that can say, hey, look, am I crazy or is everybody else around here crazy, right? And the people to be able to say, no, Brad, that's on you in this instance, but here's what I would do. Or no, yeah, that's really not right. And here's some thoughts about how to navigate. So I just want to go back to that piece for the wider audience listening. And I think mentors, sponsors, and confidants are absolutely critical to success. Joseph, your question was with regards to sponsors and the leveling, and there's only so many in the volume. And I don't disagree. But I do think that the sponsors don't necessarily always have to be, at the tippy top of the organization there, right? They can be individuals who, and they don't necessarily have to be the same for every person, or for every instance, right? And so they can be different. So I would just encourage people to look in different areas or different parts of the organization to be sponsors. Maybe it's even lateral, but people at the same band level or level within the organization. But in one particular instance, perhaps they've been around longer. So maybe they have some perceived additional political clout or relationships that this other individual might not have. And so I wouldn't necessarily always say it only has to be a small handful of people. So that's one thing. The other thing, though, I think it's also important in terms of how are those sponsorships and mentorships, how are those relationships developed? And one thing that I've seen in terms of organizations, high-performing organizations, is that they are able to do it in addition to kind of forcing it a little bit in terms of Brad meet Todd, Todd meet Brad, okay, you're mentor, mentee, okay, go have coffee, right? There's certainly some piece of that too, but there is a little bit of inauthenticity to that, a little bit forced. What we've seen some organizations do quite effectively is the power of like task forces or strategic initiatives. And those are deliberately filled, those task forces are filled with high performing individuals at different band levels and hopefully from different representative groups, ethnic, gender, orientation, etc. And they're working on a mission critical initiative for the company that is viewed by the top company that senior leaders in the organization might have some say in, or they might be working in collaboration with them. And that in that instance, that enables some people to actually see the people at work. It enables them to provide active feedback. I saw you in this presentation when you deliver this, great job. Here's what I would do to improve it. Or here's one thing I would start to do some analysis. Or Audrey, I'd love to get some time on your calendar. As you know, I'm part of this task force doing this. And it creates a little bit more of a natural relationship to help form some of that mentorship and sponsorship. So that's also a way that I would encourage organizations to help develop and foster those relationships there, to make them a little bit more natural than a little bit more forced.
That's helpful. And Todd, and perhaps Brad has covered this a bit, but it's human nature to seek out leaders who come from similar experiences, backgrounds, education. We look for those folks who may be geographically from the same areas we are. I mean, how do you sort of look at the mentor-sponsor relationship and look at it from a career path basis and try to align the relationship on sort of identifying talent that on a career path versus on sort of those personal dynamics of connectivity for business leaders as they think about this?
It's a great question. I think taking out a mentor sponsor for just a second, humans seek out comfort, right? We seek out to find our tribe or our people or whatever term you want to use. And that's what we have always done in history. And so the idea is finding a way to sort of break down those barriers, but make that comfortable versus being forced, right? If, I think about, segregation in the South and forced busing and all those sort of things that were, trying to break down the structures of racism and segregation, but it's a really hard thing to do. And so sort of acknowledging that, I think, is important, that people want to create safety and feel safe with people around them. And think of it from that spot first. If you can create an organization or in a culture where people feel safe being with people of difference, whatever that is, I think that's important. It's also important to remember that managing diversity and managing diverse people and diverse perspectives is hard. It's not easy to do, right? And Audrey is laughing. We don't talk enough about that. We have not taught people how to lead in organizations. We don't teach people how to manage and how to interview and how to give feedback. In Wall Street, for example, it's the highest performer gets to run the desk, and that's an overnight transition. And we didn't teach that person to do any of the things that leaders need to do, right? So giving feedback to people of difference is hard. And that's where sponsorship and mentorship can come in and teach people that. I remember Sylvia Hewlett had data years ago around sponsorship and the gendered nature of sponsorship. On average, if I remember correctly, men have 11 sponsors in their career, and on average, women have 2. And if a woman's sponsor leaves a company, she will leave within 12 months of that sponsor leaving the company. And so if you think about it that way, when I speak to audiences that are primarily women, I encourage them. I'll tell you what's funny. It's the quote unquote good old boys network. Men naturally network with each other. Men naturally try to help each other because that's for lots of sort of reasons that if you're just looking at the gender binary, by the way, and I realize this isn't the full gender spectrum, but just looking at the gender binary, women actually look at it as, I'm smart, I work hard, I'm well educated, I should be recognized for the work that I do in a meritocracy, but corporations are not meritocracies. And understanding that is really, really important. It's who you know and how you know them and who's your sort of protector and who's pulling you up. And Audrey, you actually said it's who's speaking about you in the room when you're not there. Sometimes that has to do with your skills because somebody's believing in you, hopefully. And if they're sponsoring you, then your opportunity as a protege is to make them look good, right? You have to sort of pay that forward. But all of those are dynamics that people don't always know and aren't taught. Those are the sort of unwritten rules of culture in companies. And so I think the opportunity, especially if you come from a diverse background, you probably didn't have that opportunity to know that right now. You weren't taught that in grade school. You weren't taught that when you came into the company. And there are people who were. And so finding ways to sort of educate people on these unwritten rules of how to find a sponsor, how do you ask for a sponsor? I mean, Joseph, that was your actual original question before I rambled on. But that is an important thing, right? The idea that you do have to go up and find someone, and it might be someone from your background because that's where your comfort level is, and that's okay. But asking for those sponsors the sponsorship is the most important relationship in your career. Mentors are important, but sponsors are vital.
And Audrey, just a quick follow-up. How do we leverage BRGs and ERGs in terms of identifying that next gen talent or helping to facilitate the mentorship and sponsorship and confidant elements that Brad and Todd have spoken to?
Yeah, I'd actually like to they'll build on something that Todd said, which is sponsors are important. You have to ask for them. I have two thoughts there. One, it is likely, right, that there are people who are sponsors for you that you will never know, right? That is one of the beautiful parts of the systemic enculturation of programs like Bradley talked about, right? Where leaders are experiencing these folks in ways that they wouldn't have been able to if it were not for this task force's project. And they may be speaking up for you and you never know. I imagine there are many of us with fairy godmothers, fairy godfathers, right? Who have done that for us. I think the other piece though is that to Todd's point, people feel comfortable being with people who are like them or who they assume is like them. So I'll start there. And I think there are two pieces to that. I think there's definitely the notion that organizations have to be very clear about how they define diversity so that folks who want to be in places and with their tribe that's comfortable with them understands that the organization recognizes that not just one portion of your affinity is the one that has to drive how you find your tribe, right? So I may have something in common with someone who looks completely different from me, right? Because diversity at FINRA is, the way we define it is not just about your visible differences. It's literally everything that makes you uniquely you that you bring to the table. And so we have to find opportunities to surface all of those different unique things so that people can find their tribes in ways that aren't as necessarily directed by the way that the government asks us to count them, right? I think the second piece of that is sponsors, by definition, may look very different than the people they're sponsoring because there may not be another Black woman in the room that has influence, right? When it's time for the conversation to happen about Audria's next career move. And so we have to really recognize that sponsorship, mentorship, it's all very important. Those relationships are important. Sometimes they're informal, sometimes they're unknown, but more than anything, I need people to really understand that you should not limit yourself to only seeking out sponsors who you feel like you have an immediate visible connection to, because for many of us, we did not have the luxury of being able to reach across and say, hey, you look like me. Representation matters, right? And I'm not going to cry today, but please, if you haven't seen it, go look at the Little Mermaid videos that are happening on TikTok, because if you've never seen anyone who looks like you in that space, it can be you can have a sense of despair And you may not know that you're able to overcome that ceiling. And it is tough being the first of anything. So you got to be brave and reach out to people who are in positions of power, even if they don't look like you. So I did want to go there.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you not shedding tears. But I understand that emotion and that feeling. It seems like every day we're seeing a first in one form or fashion, and
Yeah.
it's terrific that we are, as culturally, we're breaking that ground and overcoming those boundaries. Brad, I did want to pivot to you that there's a generational element to this conversation when we think about sort of the segmentation of the workforce at most companies, with baby boomers and Gen X leaders disproportionately comprising the senior executive ranks in within most corporations, and then Gen Y, Gen Z comprising many of the more junior professional roles. How can mentorship and sponsorship strategies disrupt the reality and create greater integration across generational boundaries within the workforce?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just a natural dynamics as demographics start to shift over time. Again, I think one of the key pieces regarding that is for individuals as well as corporations to listen and to learn. It sounds like such a basic thing, but I do think it is so vitally important. It is so vitally important across a variety of different dimensions. Because the more you listen, the more you can inform yourself. The more you inform yourself, the more you can educate yourself. Once you're educated, then you can hopefully make even better decisions, not only for yourself, for individuals that you might work with, and broadly speaking for corporations. And so as there starts to be this, dichotomy in terms of the old generation, new generation, and, it happens all the time. I don't get this next generation or this or that. I get it. But have you started to listen, right? And ask the questions and try to seek that understanding. And so, Joseph, that's just, I wish I could say that from my point of view, there was something more, I guess, scientific or deeper than that. But I do think that's where it all emanates from that point. That's just being able to at least be aware.
Thank you. And Todd, when we think about Gen Y and Gen Z, how do we create that value paradigm where they feel like their contributions to the organizations are valued, that they are integral to the success of the organization? And in particular, looking at it from the standpoint of attrition, how do we make them, help them to see that they have a role and there's growth and there's opportunity for them, and whether it's through allyship, mentorship, or sponsorship, how do we make sure they know they are a key part of the work force, that we want to do everything we can to see them succeed, and that their success is integral to the organization's success?
It's a great question, and I think Bradley had a great perspective on sort of the top line of that. I think several things. One, I mean, we have to acknowledge we have 4 generations working in the workplace right now, which in history of the corporates, that really hasn't happened before the last 10 years. And they do want something different. Gen Z wants something very different from baby boomers. Cross generationally, we don't communicate super well. Right. I mean, as Bradley said, people are like, I don't get this younger generation, and the younger generation is like, these people are old, need to go away. And there are challenges therein. In the LGBTQ space, it's really fascinating. I kind of feel like I study that for I have studied that for a long time around the world. The baby boomers and the gay community weren't able to even be out. Right. When they started in the workplace in the late 70s, being gay was still considered a psychological disorder in the United States. 1978, that was repealed. If you think about the age of AIDS, the guys like me who came in Gen X, I say guys, LGBTQ people of my generation came in, but especially men, we didn't have mentors because they all died. Literally, there were no people I could look up to with role modeling. And there's a whole cohort of us in our 40s right now who are actually finding each other and actually having these conversations about what does it mean to be a successful gay person in our 40s, because the world has changed so much. The gender spectrum and the Gen Zs have a very different experience because they were able to grow up in a world that we helped them create, right? AIDS is no longer going to kill them. We were told from, like, I remember being 5 years old and thinking AIDS is going to kill me. That was, most of our generation knew that. We could be fired in all 50 states when we started work. Gen Z has none of those issues, which is fantastic. It means they can come in without the baggage that we had. But at the same point, I talk about it all the time. They have to understand who came before them and who provided that. And that's the same for any of these diverse communities. The people that have fought for many years to provide the safety and the inclusion that we have now. It's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better than it was 20 years ago. And so understanding that and the perspective people have, Gen Y grew up with will and grace, right? And Gen Z grow up with the ability to have 65 gender markers on Facebook, right? Which is awesome. These are all great, but understanding their perspectives is a challenge, especially because it is such a moving target. Language keeps changing and people have challenges with it. And we have to give people a chance to catch up. We have to be kind to people and not destroy them on Twitter when they make one mistake. Because this cancel culture thing that we have found ourselves in is toxic, not helpful, and doesn't help. It won't actually help us progress. And so that intergenerational conversation that we are trying to have, we have a piece of research called Out to Succeed that we published 4 years ago. It's the first global LGBT millennial research. And we had Gen Ys in the US, Europe, Asia, and Australia. We're doing a refresh of that to look at all 4 generations in the workplace globally to try to create some data and understanding that we're publishing next year, because it is a challenge, not just LGBTQ folks, but all the people in the workplace.
Well, that's outstanding, and we look forward to that research and helping us all improve performance across industry. Audrey, we're down to our final 6 minutes. This is my final question to you and the panel. We often consider succession planning strategies through the lens of recruitment, of retirements in the workforce, but how can mentorship and sponsorship help achieve greater continuity in the more junior roles, particularly in the frozen middle of organizations?
Well, I think first that succession planning can't only happen at the top of the house, right? Succession planning has to happen at every stage of one's career. I think organizations can do a better job of empowering our less tenured team members with information, with pathways, with tools and resources, so that they feel empowered to seek out mentors and sponsors. I think we can do a better job as organizations of equipping middle leaders to be sponsors. It's interesting. Todd shared the example in the financial services industry where if you sell the most, you move up, right? And I think that you could take financial services completely out of it. In most industries, we have built leaders based on technical capabilities, and we haven't always insisted, right, on building those leadership competencies from the very early stages of one's career. So when I think of sponsorship and mentorship, and I think I started by saying a mentor doesn't have to be hierarchically above you in your role in an organization. It could be a peer mentorship. It could be a reverse mentorship, right? But really helping folks to understand that the engagement with other humans who have the ability to help provide you a path to speak for you when you're not in the room is critical in anybody's career progress. I'll also say, you asked the question about generations. Todd, it really touched me to realize, right, that you don't have mentors, and the reason for that in your community space. But these new kids, they are not having it. My 15-year-old will, on any day since she has been 9 years old, say, "Did you just assume my gender?" Right? So these kids who grew up in social media, who have now gone through 2 years of COVID, where their only connection and touch to other humans was through social media, was through these virtual channels, they are activists by nature, and I don't know what was in the water in 2006, but this generation, we're going to continue to see things that are different. And I think that, not to generalize about any generation, but it's true. There's kind of this middle generation between Gen X's, the millennials, the Gen Zers, where the space is, there isn't an appreciation for what came before us. I'm letting you know, this new generation, this next set of workers in our community are not going to allow us to not provide them sponsorship. They're not going to allow us to not let them mentor us and help change our behaviors, hopefully in a really positive way that impacts the cultures of our organization.
Well, that is one of the positive benefits of mentorship, sponsorship, and allyship. It's a giving and a sharing of knowledge and mutual level of respect that's gleaned from that process. We had two questions. I think we addressed the first one from the audience, but we did have a second question that I want to ask of the panel very quickly. What kind of language, particularly from a business perspective, can we leverage to help communicate the need to invest in DEI beyond web pages and websites? So as I interpret that question, what do business leaders, what do the folks and organizations need to be able to say to their senior leadership teams to get that full commitment to look beyond policies and practice, but look at the investment piece in a broader context?
I mean, I'll just start. I mean, look, I think it makes, depending on the nature of the company and what the goals and objectives, but there's a common denominator. Good DEI strategy is good fiduciary responsible thing to do for the business, because it has a direct correlation in terms of profit, it has direct correlation in terms of innovation, there's direct correlation in terms of retention, and it has a direct correlation in terms of one's ability to have connectivity with customers. There's all kinds of stats and data. I won't kind of rattle it off there, but it has been empirically proven to be, and quantitatively proven to be, have a direct correlation on that. So I always say to folks, particularly in my DE&I hat, like, look, if you have a fiduciary interest in this business or a fiduciary steward of this business, you should care about DE&I, because there's few other things that are going to have as direct an impact on the organization as well as your employees.
And Todd, before we close, before we do my closing, anything to add there?
I would just say framing it from an ESG perspective is something we're doing a lot of. We're launching an out leadership return on equality initiative, we're calling it, around having LGBTQ inclusive DEI embedded in ES and G, not just the S. And the idea that this is literally how companies, I think as Bradley just said, have to do business going forward. There's no option. The business case, if you're still asking for the business case, that was 15 years ago. There's a great Peter Drucker quote that I love that I'll end on, which is, he says, in business, you don't have to change. Survival is optional.
Excellent, excellent. Well, on behalf of my colleagues, I want to first say thank you to each of you in the audience for joining us today. Audrey, Todd, and Brad, thanks for your expertise and wisdom, as for your respective organizations' leadership in fostering greater DEI and inclusion throughout corporate America. 2022 marks the 21st anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks and on our nation. Although 21 years have passed, we honor and remember the 2,983 Americans who paid the ultimate sacrifice in honor of freedom. Our thoughts are with their friends and families, and may their memory be a blessing to them and to us all. Finally, I would like to take a moment to thank two Invariant summer interns, Shira Minsk and Evan Batiste, whose research and enthusiasm helped create the framework for today's session. Shira is a junior at Yale University studying history and mathematics, and Evan Batiste is a junior at Howard University studying political science. Thanks, Evan and Shira, for your contributions, and thanks, everyone. We look forward to sharing additional information with you from this session. We appreciate you and look forward to seeing you at Invariant's next DFC. Be well.